The rain came down in sheets that night. The kind of cold November rain that didn't fall so much as it hammered, pounding the cracked asphalt of the alley behind Eddie's diner, like it had something to prove. The kind of rain that found every gap in your clothes, every weakness in your shelter, every soft place left in a person who had already given up most of what she had to give. Maren Holloway sat with her back against the wet brick wall, her 37 years etched into the lines around her eyes, into the chap of her lips, into the way her shoulders curved forward to make a roof of her own body. In her arms, her 3-year-old son, Beckett, slept, his small chest rising and falling with that soft catching wheeze she had come to know the way other mothers knew lullabies. Every breath he took was a question. Every breath he took was an answer. She had folded a piece of cardboard into a kind of awning over them both, propped against a dumpster that smelled of grease and old bread. It wasn't much. It wasn't anything, really. But it kept the worst of the rain off Beckett's face, and that was all she could ask of the world that night. Beside her, pressed tight against the wall with the wary stillness of an animal that had learned to read shadows, was her 15-year-old daughter, Wren. The girl wore a hooded sweatshirt 2 sizes too big. The cuffs pulled down over her hands, her short dark hair damp against her forehead. A threadbare blanket lay across her shoulders. Her eyes never stopped moving. Even when Wren seemed to be staring at nothing, she was watching everything. "Mom?" Wren's voice cut soft through the drumbeat of the rain. "Someone's coming." Maren's arms tightened around Beckett before she even thought about it. Some instincts you didn't have to learn twice. The back door of the diner swung open, and a wedge of harsh fluorescent light spilled into the alley, throwing their shadows long and trembling across the wet ground. Maren held her breath. It was Tony. Tony Greer worked the late shift. He was somewhere in his 50s. A man with thick forearms and a grease-stained apron, and a face that had seen better decades. He stepped out into the rain with a paper bag balanced in one hand, the way a man steps out onto thin ice. "Hey," he said, his voice barely louder than the rain. "Burned a batch of fries, shame to throw them out." He set the bag down on an overturned milk crate within their reach. He didn't look at them. He never did. That was the kindness of it. "Manager's gone home for the night," Tony said. "You should be all right till morning." "Thank you," Maren whispered. Tony just nodded once and went back inside, and the door closed, and the harsh light vanished, and the alley was dark again, dark and cold, and theirs. Wren reached for the bag. The fries were still warm. There was a hamburger in there too, wrapped in foil, cut in half. Tony always cut things in half. He never said why. He never had to. "At least somebody in this town has a heart," Wren muttered. Maren didn't answer. She watched her daughter eat, watched the way Wren broke off half of her, half, and slid it back into the bag for Beckett to find when he woke up. The girl had learned things on the street that no 15-year-old should have to learn. How to make a meal stretch, how to disappear when men looked at her the wrong way, how to keep a small folding knife in her boot and pretend her mother didn't know about it. Maren knew. She closed her eyes and let her cheek rest against the top of Beckett's head, and for a moment she let herself remember. Nathan. 8 months ago, or 9, depending on how you counted the days, she had stopped counting. Nathan Holloway, her husband of 12 years, had gone to work on a Tuesday morning at a construction site outside the city. He had kissed her on the temple and told her not to forget Beckett's inhaler refill, and walked out the door with his lunch in a paper sack. By that afternoon, there had been a phone call from a man whose voice was too steady. And by that evening, Maren was a widow with 2 children and no savings, and a contractor who had not, despite all of Nathan's careful insistence, carried any kind of life insurance. The bills had come like a flood after a broken dam. The car was the first to go, then the apartment, then the storage unit with most of the photographs and Nathan's tools and the wooden cradle he had built for Beckett the spring before he was born. They had tried the shelter downtown once, just once. The intake worker had taken one long look at Wren, tall for her age, hooded and watchful, and asked in a voice that brooked no argument whether she shouldn't be placed on the men's side. That night, a man had pounded on their door for what felt like hours, screaming for someone named Donna, screaming for drugs, screaming for the sake of screaming. By morning, Maren had decided that the alley was safer than the system. At least in the alley they were together. That was the line she repeated to herself every night like a prayer she no longer believed in, but could not stop saying. At least we are together. At least we are together. At least we are together. The rain slackened some time before dawn, easing into a fine, cold drizzle that hung in the air like a held breath. Maren had not slept. Her back ached from the brick. Her legs had gone numb in stages she had stopped noticing. Beckett stirred against her, blinking up with his father's eyes, and the sight of them in the grey morning light hurt her in a place she did not have a name for. "Morning, buddy," she whispered, summoning a smile from somewhere she did not know she still owned. Wren was already up repacking their 2 worn backpacks with the quiet efficiency of long practice. Toothbrushes, a folded clean shirt for Beckett, the half hamburger saved, a water bottle empty waiting for the gas station bathroom sink. The back door opened again. This time it was Dave, the morning manager, a soft-bodied man in a flannel shirt, his face apologetic in the way of men who have been told to do something they do not want to do. "Maren," he said. He knew her name. He had given it to her the first time like a small, careful gift. "I'm real sorry, but the owner drove by last night, saw the setup. He says if you're still here when he opens, he's calling the police." Maren nodded. She had been nodding her whole life, it sometimes seemed. "We'll be gone in 10 minutes, Dave." "I'm sorry," he said again, and he meant it. And that was almost the worst part. When the door shut, Wren muttered low and bitter, "We're invisible until somebody wants us gone." The girl sounded 50 years old when she said it. Maren did not have an answer to give her. They gathered their 2 backpacks, which contained everything they owned in the world. The wedding ring had gone months ago for a motel room during one of Beckett's worst asthma attacks. The gold locket with Nathan's picture in it had gone for the last refill of Beckett's medication. All that was left of the life before was a single photograph creased at the corners of the 3 of them and Nathan, taken on Wren's 14th birthday at a little park near their old apartment. Wren was smiling in it. She didn't smile that way anymore. "Where to?" Wren asked. "Bus station," Maren said. She didn't know why. She just had to pick a direction. They walked down Main Street as the town began to wake. Shop owners unlocking doors, a bread truck unloading at the bakery, a woman in a wool coat walking a small clean dog. Normal life carried on all around them while they drifted through it untethered, and Maren kept her eyes straight ahead and did not look at any of it. "Gracie!" a voice called. Maren stopped. "Gracie Holloway, is that you?" She turned. An older woman stood outside the pharmacy across the street, grey hair pinned back in a neat bun, a wool coat buttoned to the throat, a paper pharmacy bag in one hand. The woman was looking at her with an expression Maren did not recognize. And then she did. And it was a name that came back to her from a long way off. Nobody had called her Gracie since she was 9 years old. Gracie had been her grandfather's name for her. "Della," the woman supplied gently. "Della Whitlock. I live next door to your grandfather Silas up on Cedar Hollow. You used to spend summers with him when you were little. You and your mama, you'd catch fireflies in jars up on the ridge." The memory surfaced like something rising slowly out of dark water. A porch swing painted white, the smell of pine pitch and wood smoke. A man with rough hands lifting her up to see a hawk on a fence post. A woman next door with a basket of tomatoes from her garden. "Mrs. Whitlock," Maren said, and her voice broke on it. Della's eyes moved over her, then slow and steady, taking in the wet hair and the worn coat, and Wren standing a half step back with her shoulders squared, like a body between her mother and a stranger, and Beckett on Maren's hip with his little face still soft from sleep. Something shifted in the older woman's face. Not pity, something kinder than pity. "I'm just in town for a doctor's appointment," Della said, picking up my prescription. "But my goodness, child, have you eaten? Let me buy you all some breakfast." Wren shot her mother a hard warning look. They had learned, the both of them, that offers of help came with strings, and the strings always cinched tight when you weren't paying attention. But there was something in Della's eyes that did not feel like a string. "Thank you," Maren said. "That would be very kind." 20 minutes later, they sat in a corner booth at the Sunrise Cafe across from the pharmacy, the windows fogged from the warmth inside. Beckett was working through a stack of pancakes with the single-minded devotion of a small boy who had not seen pancakes in a long time. Syrup ran down his fingers, and he didn't notice, and Maren did not have the heart to wipe it away. Wren had ordered a hot chocolate and a breakfast sandwich, and was eating both with a wariness that almost broke Maren's heart in a different way. Maren herself wrapped her cold hands around a mug of coffee and let the warmth seep into her bones for the first time in what felt like weeks. Della watched them with quiet eyes. "You said you were just between places," she said carefully. "But that isn't quite right, is it, honey? We're managing, Gracie." Della's voice was soft. "I knew you when you were knee-high. Your mama was a proud woman, and I can see you inherited that. But sometimes pride costs more than it pays." Maren looked down into her coffee. "How long, sir?" Della asked. 7 months. Wren answered when Maren didn't. "Since they took the car." Della set her cup down with a soft clink against the saucer. "Then you don't know," she said, "about Silas." Maren looked up. "My grandfather." The words felt strange in her mouth. "I haven't seen him since I was 9. He left the ridge. There was some kind of trouble. My mother never talked about it. I always thought, he never left child." Della's eyes were sad and steady. "He moved out of the big house to a smaller place on the same land. After the incident, whatever it was. But he never left Cedar Hollow. He died 2 years ago this past spring. The county's been trying to find a next of kin ever since." The cafe went quiet around her. Maren could hear the clink of a fork on a plate at another table. She could hear Beckett humming softly to himself. She could hear the rain starting up again against the window. "Heir to what?" she said. Her voice was very small. "To the Holloway place. The main house, which I won't lie to you isn't in good shape. The land, and—" Della hesitated and reached into her purse and unfolded a piece of paper with the slow care of someone handling something fragile. "And the cabin. The one that's been sealed since 1945. Wren leaned forward. "Sealed. Right after the war ended. Some government business during the war years. Nobody ever knew exactly what." Della tapped the paper. "I kept this. I had a feeling somehow that someday somebody would come looking. The taxes have all been paid up. Silas was peculiar about that. Said nobody was going to take his land for back taxes. Not after what they'd already tried to take from him." Maren read the paper with hands that would not quite stop trembling. "Property Holloway family parcel. Includes primary residence condemned and 1 outbuilding cabin sealed by order 1945. Notices of inheritance posted. If no heir claims by December 31st, ownership reverts to Cedar County." "December 31st, Maren whispered. "That's 3 weeks from now." Della folded her hands on the table. "I've got a spare room," she said. "It's small. There's a bed and a trundle. Not much, but it's warm and it's got a door that locks from the inside. You come back with me to Cedar Hollow. Stay until you figure things out. The bus leaves at noon." Wren's eyes widened. "Mom," she whispered. And there was a crack in her careful voice, something like hope pushing up through the asphalt of 7 months. Maren felt dizzy. "Why are you helping us?" she asked. Della's eyes went soft in a way that suggested she had been asked that question before and had answered it before and was tired of the world that made it necessary to ask. "Because Silas would have wanted it," she said. "Because your mama was like family once. And because—" She nodded toward Beckett, happily licking the last of the syrup from his spoon. "Because that little boy deserves walls. It's that simple, honey." 3 hours later, Maren sat on a bus winding higher into mountains she had not seen since she was a child. Beckett pressed his nose against the cold window, delighting in the snow-dusted pines that thickened as they climbed. Wren sat across the aisle, her face turned to the glass, and Maren could not quite read her expression. But it was not the closed expression she had worn for months. Della filled the journey with the kind of gentle conversation that asked nothing in return. "That cabin," she said, "they used it during the war for some kind of operation. A listening post, most folks thought, intercepting radio signals, monitoring enemy communications." "Like spies?" Wren asked. "Something like that." And then in the late summer of 45, county officials came up with 2 men in black sedans, padlocked the cabin, nailed an official placard to the door, told everyone in Cedar Hollow it was a sealed federal facility. "Do not enter for your own safety." And my grandfather just accepted that. "He never broke the seal," Della said. "Not in 80 years. Moved into the main house down the slope. But over the years he grew quieter, watchful, especially when the war came up in conversation. Or the company, as he called it. What company? That's just it, child, he never said. Cedar Hollow was mining country back then. Lots of operations digging for various minerals, especially during wartime. The bus crested a final hill, and Cedar Hollow came into view, a small town tucked into a valley. Wood smoke rising from chimneys surrounded by dense forest and the rough shoulders of the Appalachians. "Welcome home, Gracie," Della said. The probate office was a tired little room above the hardware store, with a tired little clerk behind the counter. When Maren laid down her driver's license and explained who she was, the clerk's eyes widened, and he went into a back room and came out with a thick file labeled Holloway in faded marker. "I'll be damned," he said. "We've been trying to find you for 2 years. Where have you been?" "Not receiving mail," Maren said. The clerk did not ask further. He had been at this job long enough to know better. She signed papers until her hand cramped. With each signature, she became the owner of more of something she did not yet understand. The condemned house, the sealed cabin, the land. Couple conditions, the clerk said. Main house was condemned 10 years back. Unsafe structure. You can't live in it without significant repairs and a re-inspection. And the cabin remains under the original sealing order unless officially released by the Department of Defense. Department of Defense, Wren echoed. Wartime operations, the clerk said. Above my pay grade, young lady. They stepped out onto the sidewalk into a cold gray noon, and a black SUV pulled up to the curb so smoothly it might have been waiting. The man who got out wore an expensive parka that did not belong in Cedar Hollow. He was perhaps in his middle 50s, gray at the temples, with the kind of polished smile that had been rehearsed in mirrors. "Miss Holloway." He extended a hand. "Roland Vance. Regional Operations Ironwood Holdings. Word travels fast in small towns. I understand you've just claimed your grandfather's property. Congratulations." Maren did not take the hand. She felt Wren step closer to her shoulder, and Beckett's small fingers tighten in the collar of her coat. "News travels fast," she said. "I was hoping we could talk." Roland Vance gestured toward a coffee shop 2 doors down. "Ironwood has had an interest in parcels near your grandfather's land for some years. Natural resources don't observe property lines, you understand. We could discuss some mutually beneficial arrangements." "We just signed the papers." Of course. His smile did not waver. "But that main house is essentially a teardown, and that old cabin." His expression shifted just a fraction, like a man stepping carefully over a hidden line. "Probably unsafe. Possibly contaminated given whatever military operations went on there. Asbestos, lead paint, who knows what else. You have small children, Miss Holloway. You want to keep them safe." The word contaminated landed in Maren's chest like a cold stone. Vance reached into his pocket and produced a business card with the easy gesture of a man who had handed out 1,000 of them. "I can have you signed onto a cash sale by the end of business today," he said. "Enough to put you into a real apartment somewhere. A nice place for the little ones. Somewhere safe." 7 months ago, Maren might have taken it. 7 months ago, she would have grabbed the card with both hands. But something in the smoothness of Roland Vance set off a quiet alarm in the back of her mind, a small steady ringing she had learned not to ignore. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Vance," she said. "We'll think about it." "Of course, smart to do your homework." He turned to go, then turned back almost as an afterthought. "Just bear in mind, property values change, options change. I wouldn't wait too long." He got back into the black SUV and it pulled away. "I don't like him," Wren said flatly. "That makes 2 of us," Della muttered. Ironwood's been buying up property all over the county for 10 years. Always with these environmental surveys, only nobody ever sees any actual scientists, just men in suits making offers. "He said contamination," Maren said, holding Beckett tighter. "What if that's their favorite tactic?" Della's mouth thinned. "Scare you into selling cheap. Silas got the same pitch years ago. He told them where they could stick their offer." "But what if it's true?" Wren pressed. Della looked up at the wooded ridge above the town where somewhere on the slope a sealed cabin sat among the pines. "The only thing contaminating that cabin," she said, "is the truth. That's what Silas always said. Truth's the most dangerous toxin to the powerful. He'd say it like a riddle. Most folks thought he was just an odd old veteran, but he wasn't odd, child. He was scared. The road up to the Holloway property wound higher through stands of pine heavy with snow, the truck's tires crunching on gravel and rock salt. It was late afternoon when Della turned onto a narrow drive marked by a weathered wooden sign so faded the letters had nearly gone. Holloway Ridge, private property. The main house came into view first, and Maren's heart sank. The roof had partially caved on one side. The porch sagged. Windows gaped where glass had been. Raccoon tracks crisscrossed the snow around the foundation. It wasn't this bad when Silas was alive, Della said quietly. Vacant houses don't last long in mountain winters. But Maren's eyes had already moved past the ruined house, past the broken porch, past the sagging roof, up the slope into the darkening trees where a smaller building sat tucked among the firs. The cabin. Something about the squat, dark shape of it against the deepening sky put a chill in her that had nothing to do with the weather. "Can we get up there?" she asked. "There's a path, treacherous in the snow. I want to see it before dark." The path was steep and slick in places, ice rising through the snow in mean little patches. Beckett rode on Maren's hip, his small arms locked around her neck, his breath misting against her cheek. Wren followed close behind her. City sneakers ill-suited for the climb, but her jaw set with a determination that brooked no discussion. The cabin was smaller than Maren had imagined. A squat, sturdy little building of dark logs, its pitched roof carrying a heavy load of snow. A heavy rusted padlock held a chain across the door. Boards had been nailed across the windows, some beginning to rot at the corners but still firm. And centered on the door frame, faded, but still legible after 8 decades, was the placard. U.S. property, restricted area, sealed 1945. No entry. Beneath it, in a different hand, etched roughly into the wood with what must have been a pocket knife, was something else. Maren stepped closer and brushed away the frost with her glove. For family eyes only. When truth matters more than fear. The handwriting was her grandfather's. She knew it without knowing how she knew. The same hand that had once written her name in birthday cards she had thrown away because her mother said to. Wren pulled out her phone and took a photograph. The flash lit the door for one stark instant, throwing the words into sharp relief. "What do you think is in there?" she whispered. "I don't know," Maren said. But her hand was on the door now, just resting on the cold wood, as if her grandfather might somehow feel her there 80 years late. "We should head back," Della urged, her own voice low, as if not to disturb something. "I cleaned up a room in the main house that's still stable, patched the roof myself last summer, just in case. We can sleep there tonight, safer than trying that path in the dark." That night, huddled around a small space heater, in the one stable room of the ruined main house, eating Della's canned soup warmed on a camp stove, Maren felt the weight of the day pressing on her chest. Beckett curled against her side, his breathing easier in the dry indoor air than it had been in weeks. Wren had fallen asleep almost the moment her head touched the rolled-up coat she used for a pillow. Della had gone to her own house down the slope for the night. The wind moved through the broken boards of the upper floor, and somewhere in the rafters a board creaked, and Maren stared at the cracked plaster ceiling above her and tried not to think. She failed. She thought of Nathan, of his hands, of the way he used to come home with sawdust in his hair, of the morning he had kissed her temple and walked out the door for the last time and not known it. She thought of the alley behind the diner. She thought of the man pounding on a shelter door. She thought of a sealed cabin on a ridge that had waited 80 years for her. She thought of Silas Holloway, a grandfather she had not seen since she was 9. A man she had been told vaguely had gone off somewhere, made some kind of trouble, was not to be spoken of. A man who had in fact never left this ridge at all, who had lived and died not 3 miles from where she now lay, while she had grown up believing he was a ghost. She must have slept eventually because she dreamed. She dreamed of a young man standing among dark pines, the snow falling in slow, heavy flakes around him. He wore a wool army coat with the collar turned up, and his face was the face she remembered from a photograph her mother had kept hidden in a drawer, a face younger than Maren's own. He looked at her with eyes she knew. "I tried to protect you," he said, and the snow fell through him as if he were already gone. "By keeping it closed. Maybe I was wrong." Maren tried to answer. She tried to say his name. But the wind took her voice and the snow took him. And she woke to a bitter cold dawn and a sun that was glinting hard off the ice-laden branches. She lay still for a long moment, listening to her children breathe. Then she sat up. "If this land is ours," she said when Wren stirred, "we need to know what's on it." Wren looked up from helping Beckett with a bowl of oatmeal Della had brought up at first light. The girl's eyes brightened in a way Maren had not seen in months. Della stood in the doorway with a thermos in one hand and an expression Maren could not quite read. "Silas never wanted that seal broken," the older woman said carefully. "At least that's what he always claimed publicly. But that message he carved." She hesitated. Then she reached into her bag and brought out an old metal toolbox, dented and well used, and meticulously cared for. "These were his. I've kept them since he passed. He told me once if anyone of his blood ever came back, they were to have these." He didn't say why. The toolbox contained a hammer, screwdrivers, pliers, the kind of tools a careful man kept in working order for 60 years. Maren ran her fingers across the smooth handle of the hammer. Her grandfather's hand had worn that handle smooth. The handle was warmer than the air around it, or maybe she only imagined that. They walked up to the ridge through the cold, bright morning, the path easier now in the daylight. At the cabin door, Maren studied the rusted padlock, the warped chain, the placard that had hung there for 80 winters. "Mom, wait," Wren said. She pulled out her phone. "I want to record this, just in case." "In case of what?" "In case somebody tries to say we never found anything, or tries to take it away." Maren nodded. 7 months of homelessness had taught them both that the world did not play fair with people who had no power. She raised the hammer. The first strike rang through the clearing, sharp and clean, startling a pair of crows from a nearby branch. The second strike dented the metal of the lock. By the fifth blow, the rust was flaking off in sheets. On the seventh, with a sharp crack that echoed off the trees, the lock shattered. Maren pulled the chain loose. It fell to the snow with a heavy, dead sound. The door was swollen in its frame. She set a shoulder against it. For one bad moment, she thought it had been nailed from inside. Then, with a long protest of wood and old hinges, it gave way. The first breath of air from inside was dry, dust-heavy, tinged with something metallic like old solder, like radio wire. She stepped over the threshold. Wren and Beckett came after her. Della remained in the doorway as if reluctant to fully enter a space that had been sealed since before she was born. A narrow cot stood against one wall, an army blanket folded with military precision at its foot. A bulky shortwave radio sat on a wooden desk, its microphone still angled toward an empty chair, as if its operator had only just stepped out. Stacks of yellowed papers were arranged on shelves. Maps covered one wall, colored pins marking routes across the Pacific and Europe. A metal filing cabinet stood in the corner, its drawers labeled in a careful hand. Transcripts, intercept logs, field reports. "It really was a listening post," Wren whispered. Maren did not answer. Her eyes had gone to the desk, to the small wooden box set precisely in the center of it, as if placed there for someone expected. A name had been written on the lid in shaky, careful handwriting she recognized from the door outside. "For Maren, when you have nothing left to lose." Her hands trembled as she lifted it. The clasp was not locked. The hinges side open. Inside lay 3 things. An old war bond certificate yellowed at the edges. A small house key on a faded paper tag that read, "Main House Secret Room," and a sealed envelope. She broke the seal with fingers that would not stop shaking, and unfolded the letter, and her grandfather's voice came up off the page 80 years late. She read it standing up in the cold gray light of the cabin he had sealed and not entered for a lifetime. She read about a young soldier who had come home from one war and walked without knowing it straight into another. She read about a mining company called Piedmont that had used the war years as cover for things that did not bear the light of day. About land taken from families while their sons were overseas. About work camps with no records. About men, local men, poor men. Men from the hollows who had vanished into those camps and not come home. She read about the day a young Silas Holloway had been told to seal the cabin and forget what was in it, or his family would disappear too. She read about why he had sealed it, and she read about why he had never destroyed what was inside. One day the letter ended, "Someone in our bloodline will need this more than I needed my fear." That someone is you, Maren. She lowered the letter. Her vision had blurred. Behind her, Beckett, 3 years old and curious as small boys are curious, had wandered to the old radio. His small fingers found the dial. He turned it. For one impossible second, the long-dead machine crackled to life. A burst of static. And then, faint and thin, as something coming from a long way off, a voice spoke out of the past. The war in Europe is over. The radio went silent. The four of them stood in the cabin without speaking. Outside on the road far below, 2 black pickup trucks had quietly come to a stop at the foot of the Holloway driveway. The men in them did not get out. They simply sat and watched the ridge and waited. Maren did not see them yet. She was still standing in the cabin her grandfather had sealed in 1945, holding a letter from a dead man and listening to a voice that had been waiting 80 years to be heard. She folded the letter carefully and pressed it against her chest and looked up through the doorway past Della's silhouette, past the snow on the pines, toward the cabin's single small window where a thin gray light was rising. "Grandpa," she whispered, "I hear you now." They worked through the morning with the hush of people who had stepped into a church. Maren stood at the filing cabinet, easing each drawer open with the slow care a person uses on something old that might come apart in their hands. The drawers were stiff. The metal runners had not moved in 80 winters. But they moved now one by one with a small grudging sigh, and inside each drawer was a careful world. Folders. Tabs labeled in her grandfather's hand. Letters typewritten on onion skin paper so thin the light came through it. Carbon copies of telegrams, train manifests, pages of names. Wren spread a map across the desk, weighing the corners down with 2 heavy stones and the old microphone. It was a topographic map of the ridge and the valleys below it, hand-drawn over a printed survey, the contour lines traced in pencil that had not faded. Colored pins still bristled along its edges, red, black. A single yellow one pressed deep into the paper at a point above the main house. "Mom," Wren said quietly. "Look." A dot of red ink had been drawn at the bottom of the ridge, half a mile from where they stood. Beside it, in tiny letters her grandfather had pressed almost through the paper, were 3 words. Holloway Ridge, unauthorized shaft, 1945. Maren bent over the map. She traced the line of the contour with one fingertip. The shaft had been drilled directly beneath the western slope of their land, beneath the rocks where 80 years ago a younger version of the man she had never really known had stood and watched something happen that he could not afterward put down. "That isn't the only one," Wren said. She moved her finger across the map. Other red marks bloomed at other points along the county. Each one carried a date. Each one carried a tiny letter and number code. Each one, when Maren cross-referenced it with the folders in the cabinet, corresponded to a list of names. Names of men, pages of names, most of them with no date of return. She sat down slowly in the wooden chair at the desk. The chair that had not been sat in since her grandfather rose from it for the last time some night in late 1945. The wood creaked under her weight. The cabin was very quiet around her. She looked at the radio, at the cot, at the army blanket folded with the precision of a young man who had still believed in folding things properly. She tried to see him. She tried to see a Silas Holloway no older than Wren herself was now sitting in this chair, listening with headphones pressed to his ears to voices spilling out of the war voices in code voices in plain English voices of men in Pittsburgh and Charleston and Washington, making arrangements for things that were not meant to be overheard. She closed her eyes and let the image come. A young man in army wool, headphones, a pencil moving in a careful hand across an intercept log. The slow dawning realization that some of the voices he was hearing belonged not to the enemy abroad, but to men at home, men with offices and ledgers, men who spoke of work camps as if the camps were filing cabinets, men who spoke of disposal as if the disposed were paperwork. She saw him stand. She saw him walk down the ridge in the gray light of an early autumn morning in 1945. She saw him stand at the edge of a hidden shaft and watch something happen that he could not later describe. She saw the way his shoulders set. She saw the way his jaw tightened. She saw him refuse. She saw the man come for him. Not in uniform, in a plain dark coat. The kind of man who delivered messages without raising his voice. "Seal it," the man said. "Forget it, or your family disappears too." She opened her eyes. The cabin was still around her. The radio was silent. Beckett was sitting on the floor at her feet with a fascinated expression, turning a small brass dial with his small, careful fingers, the way a child turns over a stone to see what is under it. "Mom," Wren said. "He didn't seal it because he was afraid of the truth," Maren said. "He sealed it because he was afraid for us, for my mother, for me, for whoever came after." She lifted the letter from the desk and held it to her chest. "And he kept everything," she said. "Every page, every name. He sat on it for 60 years, because somebody someday was going to need it." The knock at Della's front door came at 12 minutes past 4 that afternoon. They had come back down off the ridge in the early dusk. Wren carrying a banker's box of carefully selected papers, Maren carrying Beckett, Della walking a few steps behind with her own coat tight at the collar. They had eaten a quiet supper at Della's small kitchen table. They had begun to lay the papers out gently in piles, the way archaeologists laid out the pieces of something broken. And then the knock came. 3 sharp raps, not angry, just certain. Maren rose. She crossed to the door and looked through the small window beside it. And there on the porch stood Roland Vance, his expensive parka glistening with the wet of fresh snow, his polished smile already in place. 2 men stood behind him. They wore Ironwood jackets. They did not smile. Della was already moving Wren and Beckett back into the kitchen, out of sight of the door. Maren opened it. She did not invite him in. "Miss Holloway." Roland Vance's voice was warm, almost paternal, the voice of a man who had once sold things on television. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. It's the dinner hour. I'll be brief then." He glanced past her into the warm yellow light of Della's hallway, and his eyes moved over the small things visible. A child's coat on a hook, a pair of small boots by the door. He took it all in with the practiced, unhurried attention of a man counting leverage. "I was hoping we could revisit our earlier conversation, with perhaps more flexibility on my side." My answer is the same. "You haven't heard the offer yet." "I know what the offer is." Roland Vance's smile did not falter. It deepened the way a smile deepens on a man who has been refused before and is rarely refused twice. 48 hours, he said softly. "That's all I'm asking. 48 hours to consider a number that will allow you to buy a home, a safe home, anywhere you want, plus a trust for the children's education." He paused with the delicacy of a man tipping a glass of poison. "It's a good deal of money, Miss Holloway. It's the kind of money that makes a person's problems go away. And in exchange we acquire the full parcel, including the structures, including whatever historical materials you may have come across in the course of your exploration." There it was. There was the string. Maren felt the cold come up through the doorway and settle behind her ribs. "And if I refuse?" Roland Vance let the silence stretch a beat too long. "Miss Holloway." His voice was almost regretful. "You have 2 small children. One of them with a serious medical condition, I understand. Asthma, is that right? You've been living in a condemned structure on a parcel that has documented contamination from wartime operations. Lead, asbestos, possibly worse. You don't know what's in there." "I don't have to know," he said gently. "I only have to make a phone call, and a child services investigator will know within the day that 2 minor children are sleeping inside a building that the county has formally declared uninhabitable. They will know that their mother declined a generous offer that would have placed them in safe and stable housing. They will draw the conclusions they draw." Maren did not move. She did not breathe. 48 hours, Roland Vance said again, almost kindly. "I'm at the Cedar Lodge. Take the time. Think it through. Do what's best for your children." He turned to go. He paused at the top of the steps. "Oh," he said, "and Miss Holloway, I'd appreciate it if nothing from that cabin left the property in the meantime, for everyone's safety." He walked back to the black SUV. The 2 men in jackets walked behind him. The doors closed with the soft, expensive sound of money. The vehicle pulled away into the falling snow. Maren shut the door. She stood with her forehead against the cold wood for a long moment, and she did not let herself shake until she was sure her children could not see her. That night, after Beckett had been put to bed in the trundle and was sleeping with his small fist tucked under his chin, Wren came and sat beside her mother on the floor of the small spare room. The girl had her phone out. She was scrolling through the photographs she had taken in the cabin, zooming in on each map and each page. "Mom," she said, stopping on one image. "Look at this one again." It was a photograph of the topographic map of Holloway Ridge. Wren zoomed in. Her finger hovered over the yellow pin, the one Maren had noticed and not thought about. The yellow pin was pressed directly into the symbol for the main house. Beside it, in their grandfather's careful pencil, was a tiny X, and beneath the X 3 letters, SR. "What does that mean?" Wren whispered. Maren looked at the key, still in the little box, still on its faded paper tag. Main house secret room, SR. She had seen it, she had read it, she had not put it together. "Get your coat," she said. The walk up the ridge in the dark was harder than it had been in daylight. The wind had come up off the valley, and the snow had thickened, falling fast and fat through the cone of the flashlight Della had pressed into Maren's hand at the door. Wren walked beside her, breath misting. Della had stayed at the bottom with Beckett. They went to the main house, not to the cabin, to the broken porch and the boarded windows and the front door that hung crooked on its frame. Inside the front room was a ruin, plaster fallen, floorboards rotted through in places. They moved carefully, picking their way by flashlight into the back of the house, into what had once been a kitchen, and beyond it into a narrow door that opened on a pantry no larger than a closet. Shelves sagged off the walls. The back wall of the pantry was paneled in tongue and groove pine gray with age water-stained along the seams. Maren ran her gloved fingers along the back panel, slow listening with her hands, the way her grandfather must have listened with his fingertips to a radio dial. She felt it, a seam, almost invisible. Where the panel met the wall at an angle that did not match the others, she pressed. The panel gave a fraction. She set her shoulder against it and slid it sideways, and a small door appeared behind it, no taller than her chest, banded in old iron. An antique keyhole. The brass was tarnished, but it was clean. Someone had kept it oiled for 60 years. The key from her grandfather's box fit perfectly. It turned with a soft click that sounded in the silence of the dead house, like the click of a door closing inside Maren's chest. The door swung inward. The room behind it was small, perhaps 6 feet square, and it was untouched. No water damage, no rot, no dust beyond a thin gray film that suggested it had been opened occasionally by a careful man and closed again with care. A wooden table, a single oil lamp, a chair. And on the table, stacked neatly, were folders. Maren lifted the first folder. It was thicker than the others. The label written in her grandfather's hand was a single word: personal. She opened it. A photograph of a young man in mining clothes, cap, lunch pail, smiling at whoever held the camera. A handwritten card, paper-clipped to the corner, gave a name and a date. He had been 22 when he had disappeared in October of 1944. Another photograph. Another young man, this one not smiling. A wife and a child clipped beside him. Another. There were 43. She did not count them in the moment. She counted them later. In the moment, she just sat down in the chair her grandfather must have sat in, and she put the folders down on the table her grandfather had built, and she let her hands rest on the wood for a long time before she opened the next folder. The next folder was not photographs. The next folder was internal correspondence. Piedmont Mining letterhead, memoranda, signed. She read for a long time. Wren read over her shoulder. There were discussions of the disappearance problem. There were discussions of how to manage inquiries from family members. There were discussions of which county officials had been reached and which would need additional encouragement. There were discussions of which workers had begun to ask questions and which were considered, the memos said, ready for transfer. The word appeared again and again, always italicized in the memos, as if those who wrote them had agreed at some point on a small private joke. Maren closed her eyes. She lifted the next folder. The label on this one was a single name, Holloway S. She looked at it for a long moment. She did not want to open it. She opened it. The first page was a personnel record. Her grandfather's name, his enlistment information, his honorable discharge, his assignment in late 1943 to a domestic intelligence detail attached to a regional industrial oversight operation. His reassignment 3 months later to direct supervisory duties at a Piedmont mining site coded with 3 letters and a number. His title was given, Site Overseer. She read it twice. She read it 3 times. "Mom," Wren said softly. Maren turned the page. The next document was the transfer memo, dated late summer 1945. The language was bureaucratic. The substance was simple. Silas Holloway had refused to participate in disposal protocols at the assigned site. He had documented his refusal in writing. He had asked his superiors to investigate the conditions at the site. He had been deemed, the memo said, unsuitable for continued supervisory work, and was being reassigned to the radio listening post at the Ridge cabin, with the understanding that any further communication of operational matters outside official channels would result in consequences for himself and his family. She lowered the page. She did not look up. The room was very quiet around her. The flashlight on the table threw a soft yellow circle on the floor. Outside, somewhere far down the ridge, an owl called once and was answered by something far away. She had come up here expecting to find her grandfather, a victim. She had not expected to find him even briefly a man who had once stood with his hand on the lever. He was an overseer, she said. Her voice did not sound like her own. He was one of them, for at least a year. He stopped, Mom. Wren's voice was small but steady. He stopped. Look, he stopped. He stopped after he saw what they did to people, not before. She set the page back down on the folder. She put both her hands flat on the table. She did not cry. She was past the place where crying came easily. She just sat and she let the weight of it settle into her, and she let it find its level. Wren came around and stood beside her chair. The girl put a hand on her mother's shoulder. He was a soldier, Wren said. He came home from one war. They put him in another one, and maybe the first year he didn't see it. And then he saw it, and he stopped. And then he spent the rest of his life keeping it all every page so that someday somebody could finish what he couldn't. Maren looked up at her daughter, the girl who had carried a knife in her boot for 7 months, the girl who had watched the alley with eyes that did not blink, the girl whose father had walked out a door one morning and not come back, the girl who at 15 had just spoken with the steady voice of a woman 3 times her age. He was a soldier who came home to find a different war. Maren said, slowly repeating the shape of what Wren had said. He fought the second one too, just quietly. He left it for you, Wren said. Not for himself, for you, to finish. Maren nodded once. She gathered the folders. She did not leave them in the secret room. She wrapped them in her coat and carried them out through the broken house and back down the snowy slope to Della's kitchen, and they laid them out on the table beside the others. By dawn, they had a list. By dawn, she had a plan. She drove down out of the mountains the next morning, alone, the banker's box of copies riding in the passenger seat of Della's old pickup truck. Wren and Beckett stayed with Della. Maren had not wanted to leave them. Della had said with the steel beneath the softness that the children were safer in her kitchen than they were on a state highway with their mother. Maren had not argued. The lawyer's office was on the 3rd floor of a brick building in a city 2 hours away. Pearl Brennan was somewhere in her early 40s, sharp-eyed with the look of a woman who had been told no by powerful people enough times to develop calluses where her patients had been. She took one of the folders from the box. She opened it. She read for 90 seconds without speaking. She set the folder down. She looked at Maren over the top of her reading glasses. "How much more like this do you have?" she asked. "A cabin full?" "Originals. Originals with copies in 3 locations." Pearl Brennan was quiet for a moment. "I have been trying to put a case on Ironwood Holdings for 9 years, she said. "I have lost every time. They have buried me in motions and depositions and a legal team the size of a small army. I have never had an original document from before the corporate restructuring. Not one." She tapped the folder. "What you have in this box, Miss Holloway, is the thing they have been spending $40 million a decade to make sure nobody ever sees. How much would they spend to make me disappear?" Pearl. Brennan did not laugh. She did not smile. "Less than you'd think," she said. "Which is why we are going to move very carefully and very fast, and we are going to put copies in places they cannot reach. I'm driving up to Cedar Hollow tomorrow morning. Do not under any circumstances leave that ridge tonight." Maren drove back into the mountains as the last light was bleeding out of the sky. She was on the long stretch of 2-lane that ran up through the gap, 20 minutes from town, when she saw the headlights come up fast behind her. Too fast, too close. She tightened her hands on the wheel. The truck was a pickup, no front plate. The headlights flashed up to high beam and stayed there, throwing her shadow against the dashboard, blinding her in the rear view. She tried to ease off and let it pass. It did not pass. It slowed when she slowed. It pushed closer. It bumped her. Not hard. Just hard enough to say it was on purpose. Maren's heart kicked once against her ribs and then went very still. Some small calm part of her, the part that had stood in an alley with 2 children in the rain and not screamed, took over the wheel and the foot and the breath. She did not pull over. She pressed the accelerator down. She knew this road. She had ridden it as a child. There was a long curve coming up, and after it the road dropped down into the valley, and a half-mile after that the first streetlights of Cedar Hollow began. Witnesses, light. The pickup behind her bumped her again, harder this time. The wheel jumped in her hands. She held it, she held it. She drove into the curve at a speed she had not driven in years. The old truck protesting under her, and the pickup behind her, followed for the length of the curve, and then as the lights of town came into view, at the bottom of the long descent, it dropped back. Then it dropped back further. And then, as the first street lamp threw its yellow light across the wet road, the pickup turned off down a logging road and was gone. Maren did not stop until she was parked in Della's driveway with all 4 wheels on the gravel. She sat at the wheel and shook for a full minute before she could trust her legs. Then she opened the door and walked into the house and put her arms around her daughter and her son and did not let them see the shaking. They saw it anyway. Wren saw everything. Wren had always seen everything. The phone rang at 11 that night. It was Tobias Marsh, the retired history teacher from the next ridge over, the man Della had sent her box of copies to that morning for safekeeping. His voice was tight. "Somebody tried to get into my house," he said, "about an hour ago. The security camera caught them. 2 men. They picked the back lock and went straight for my study. The papers weren't in the study. The papers were in a safe in the root cellar. They left when they couldn't find anything." Maren sat down on the edge of Della's couch. "They're scared," Tobias said. "Hold that, Miss Holloway. They are scared. That's a useful thing to know." She did not feel as though she held it. She felt sitting there in Della's small lamplit living room, with her children asleep upstairs, and her grandfather's letter folded in the pocket over her heart, as though she were holding a match in the wind and trying very hard to keep it lit. The next morning, Roland Vance left a voicemail at Della's house, asking in his warm television voice whether Maren had given any further thought to his offer. He reminded her that his window of flexibility was regrettably closing. He reminded her that he was at the Cedar Lodge. He reminded her that he was always available to talk. Maren listened to the message twice. Then she dialed Pearl Brennan and she set up a meeting. Not at Della's house, not at Tobias Marsh's house. In a back room at the public library with Ruth Hadley, the librarian, watching the door. She had Wren bring her phone and tuck it inside the lining of her coat, where the microphone would still pick up. She told Roland Vance to come alone. He came alone. He sat across from her at a long oak table in a room that smelled of old paper. She let him talk. She let him double the offer. She let him say in his most paternal voice that her grandfather had understood the reality of the situation. That her grandfather had stayed quiet for decades because he had known what would happen to families that did not stay quiet. That her grandfather had been a practical man. That she should be a practical woman. She waited until he had finished. She said very softly, "My grandfather was not a practical man, Mr. Vance. My grandfather was a frightened man. And he was a frightened man because of what your grandfather's company did to him. He spent 60 years in that cabin keeping a record, and then he died, and the record waited for me. So you may keep your number, Mr. Vance. You may keep your timeline. You may keep your phone calls to child services. You may take all of it, and you may go back to the Cedar Lodge, and you may explain to whoever sent you here that we are not for sale." He found his courage in the end. That's the difference between him and you. Roland Vance's face did not move, but something behind his eyes did. "You are making a mistake," he said quietly. "I want to make sure you understand that." "I understand." He rose and he buttoned his coat and he walked out of the library without looking back. That night, Maren stood on Della's porch alone. The snow had stopped. The clouds had broken. A clear, cold sky stretched over Cedar Hollow, and a sliver of moon hung above the ridge. Up on the slope, the small square window of the cabin glowed faintly. Della had begun in the evenings to leave a single oil lamp burning in it the way one lights a candle in a window for a soldier who has not yet come home. The hearing was the next morning. Maren stood with her grandfather's letter folded over her heart and looked up at the lit cabin window on the ridge, and she did not speak the words aloud, but in her chest, where the dead can sometimes still hear, she made him a promise. Tomorrow, she thought, I speak for both of us. The Cedar County Courthouse stood at the head of the town square, the way it had stood for 98 winters, a square block of grey Appalachian limestone, with 4 white columns out front, and a set of marble steps worn into soft hollows by the feet of generations who had climbed them, carrying their hopes and their grievances and their dead. On the morning of the hearing, those steps were full of people. They had been coming since before dawn. Some of them Maren recognized by now. Mrs. Ellsworth in her wool coat leaning on her cane, her grey hair pinned back the way her mother had pinned it back. The Beckett family from the south end of the county, 3 generations of them, the oldest in a wheelchair pushed by the youngest. A bus driver who had stopped Maren in the diner 2 days before to tell her that his great-uncle had been on the Site 4 list. A woman who had brought a framed photograph of her father and was holding it against her chest the way another woman might hold a child. Some of them held signs, hand-lettered. The Ridge remembers. Justice even if late. Their breath rose in slow plumes in the cold air. There were reporters too, 3 or 4 of them with cameras and notebooks drawn up the mountain by the careful press calls Pearl Brennan had been making for 48 hours. And there were the lawyers from Ironwood, a team of them, 6 men and 2 women in dark suits moving in a tight wedge up the courthouse steps, faces composed, briefcases held close. Behind them walked Roland Vance, his polished smile firmly in place, though Maren saw even from across the square that the smile no longer reached his eyes. He did not look at her as he passed. Maren stood at the bottom of the steps in a coat Della had pressed for her, with Wren on one side and Beckett asleep against her shoulder, his small head tucked into her collar. She did not feel ready. She did not think anyone was ever ready. She thought of her grandfather, and the way he had stood 80 years ago at the edge of a shaft he could not unsee, and she thought of the way a person makes themselves walk forward when their legs do not want to carry them. Della stepped up beside her. Time, the older woman said. Maren handed Beckett, still sleeping, into Della's waiting arms. She climbed the steps. The courtroom inside was paneled in dark oak and smelled of furniture polish and the faint mineral cold of a stone building in winter. Judge Eleanor Blackwood sat on the bench, a woman of perhaps 65, with a face like a clean blade, and reading glasses she did not need, but used to give herself a half-second more to think. She tapped her gavel once. The room quieted in a long, slow ripple like wind passing across a field. Pearl Brennan rose first. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She walked the court step by step through what they had found. The sealed cabin, the radio, the maps, the 43 names, the personnel records, the internal memoranda of a company that had 3 times since the war changed its name, but never changed the families who owned it. William Prescott rose for Ironwood. He was an older man with silver hair and a soft voice, and the manner of a country lawyer who had spent 20 years pretending he was not from the city. He moved to dismiss. He spoke of misinterpreted fragments. He spoke of statutes of limitation. He spoke of the regrettable instability sometimes observed in veterans who had returned from the Pacific Theater, carrying burdens no man should be asked to carry. Judge Blackwood adjusted her glasses. Mr. Prescott, she said, I'll determine what this is after I've heard the evidence. Sit down. Prescott sat. Pearl Brennan called her first witness. The geologist was a man in his 50s from the State University with a beard and a tweed jacket and a quiet authority that filled the room without effort. He laid a transparency over a projected image of the 1945 map. He pointed with a wooden pointer. Here, he said, is what the cabin map indicates. Here, he said, is what last week's ground-penetrating radar survey shows. The 2 images, when overlaid, did not differ by more than 10 feet. That isn't possible, he said simply, without first-hand knowledge of where those shafts were drilled. Whoever drew this map was there. Whoever drew this map saw it. He stepped down. The archivist came next. A small, careful woman from the State Historical Society. She had examined the documents under magnification. The typewriter fonts matched models in use at Piedmont mining offices in 1944 and 1945. The ink composition was consistent with the period. The paper had aged from the inside out as paper of that era did. Forgery, she said, was effectively impossible. The documents were what they appeared to be. She stepped down. Pearl Brennan called Mrs. Ellsworth. The old woman walked to the stand with her cane and the small, steady dignity of a person who had waited her whole life for this morning. She sat. She was sworn. She placed a small framed photograph on the rail in front of her, facing the courtroom. A young man in mining clothes, a cap, a lunch pail. He could not have been more than 19. His name was Aaron, she said. He was my uncle. He went to work on a Monday morning in October of 1944. He did not come home on Monday evening. We were told after several weeks of asking that he had taken work in Pittsburgh and had not seen fit to write. She paused. She did not cry. She was past the place where crying came easily. For 70 years, she said, our family believed that Aaron had abandoned us. My grandmother went to her grave believing that her son had not loved her enough to send a letter. My mother went to her grave believing the same. I have lived my entire life believing that my uncle was a man who walked away. She lifted her face. She looked straight at the gallery. He did not walk away. He was taken. He was worked until he died. And he was buried somewhere on that ridge without ceremony and without name. That is what these papers tell me. That is what your grandfather's records tell me, Maren Holloway. And I want it said in this room, in front of these people, that Aaron Ellsworth did not abandon his mother. He was stolen from her, and he is owed his name back. The courtroom did not move. Mrs. Ellsworth stepped down. William Prescott stood. He had a folder in his hand. He laid it on the table with the care of a man setting down a chess piece. Your Honor, he said, the defense would like to introduce a document. He turned to the gallery. He turned deliberately to where Maren sat in the second row. It is a personnel record, Prescott said. Dated July of 1944, it is signed. It is on Piedmont mining letterhead, and it identifies as the supervisory officer of the site at issue an enlisted man whose name appears repeatedly in these proceedings as a victim of conspiracy. He paused. His name was Silas Holloway. A murmur went through the courtroom. A reporter in the back row leaned forward. Roland Vance, for the first time that morning, allowed himself a small visible smile. Prescott went on. He read the document aloud. He read the title, Site Overseer. He read the dates. He let the dates hang in the air. The petitioner's star witness, he said, is a man who began this operation as one of its administrators. Whatever conclusions the petitioner has drawn from her grandfather's papers must be weighed against the fact that he was for a period of 14 months an active participant in the very system he is now being held up to expose. We submit, Your Honor, that this calls into serious question the reliability and the motivation behind all of his subsequent documentation. He sat. A long silence fell over the courtroom. Pearl Brennan rose. She glanced once at Maren. The lawyer's face was steady, but her eyes asked the question she had asked the night before. Are you ready? Maren nodded. Your Honor, Pearl said. Petitioner calls Maren Holloway. Maren rose. She did not look at Roland Vance. She did not look at Prescott. She walked the long aisle between the benches, and she did not let her steps falter. And she sat down in the witness stand, and she placed her hand on the worn black cover of the Bible, and she swore to tell the truth. She lifted her head. She looked out over the courtroom. She saw the reporter's pens poised. She saw Mrs. Ellsworth in the second row with her photograph against her chest. She saw Della holding Beckett, the small boy now awake watching his mother, with grave round eyes. She saw Wren sitting straight-backed in the front row. Her dark hair brushed, her hands folded in her lap, the way a girl sits when she has decided to be a witness to her own family's hour. She drew one slow breath. My grandfather, she said, was a soldier. The courtroom was very still. He came home from one war, and he walked without knowing it into another. He was 19 years old. He had served 3 years in the Pacific. He had buried friends. He had wanted to come home and grow tomatoes and marry a girl and forget what the inside of a transport ship sounded like at night. Instead, the army assigned him to oversee a domestic operation, and the operation was not what they told him it was. She paused. She let her hands rest on the rail. For 14 months, Buster, she said, my grandfather was a site overseer at a Piedmont mining shaft. The records that the defense has just put before this court are accurate. He signed them. He wrote them. He was by every honest definition part of the system that disappeared the men whose names sit on that table in front of you. Another murmur. She did not pause for it. And then one day in the late summer of 1945, my grandfather saw something at his site that he could not unsee. We do not know exactly what it was. There is no memo of it. There would not be. But we know what followed because he kept the paper. He filed a written refusal to participate in what the company called disposal protocols. He asked his superiors to investigate the conditions at the site. He documented his refusal in writing, knowing that putting it in writing was by itself a dangerous act. She let her eyes move across the gallery. They did not kill him. They did something worse. They told him that if he spoke of what he had seen, his family would disappear. His mother, his sister who would one day be my grandmother, the cousins he had grown up climbing pine trees with. And so they sent him up to the ridge to a small cabin with a radio, and they sealed the door behind him, and they trusted that fear would do the rest. She lifted the letter from the pocket over her heart and laid it on the rail. For 60 years, she said, my grandfather sat in his fear. He did what he was told. He did not break the seal. He did not speak. He let his own granddaughter grow up believing he had abandoned us the way Aaron Ellsworth's family believed he had abandoned them. He let me forget him. That is the price he paid to keep us alive. She paused. But every night in the dark, he kept the papers. He copied what they would not let him keep. He hid them in a room behind a pantry wall. He left a key for someone who might one day need it more than he had needed his silence. And when he died 2 years ago in a house at the foot of this ridge alone, he left me a letter. She did not read it. She did not need to. She had read it so many times she could see the shape of each line on the page without looking. He wrote, she said, that he was sorry. He wrote that he had been wrong to wait so long. He wrote that one day someone in our blood would need this more than he had needed his fear. He wrote that he hoped when that day came that I would forgive him. She lifted her face. I do not know if I have the right to forgive him, she said. There are 43 families in this county who lost men because my grandfather was for a time a part of the system that took them. There are 43 names on his lists, and any one of those families has more standing than I do to decide whether Silas Holloway is forgivable. She took a breath. But I will say this, she said. He made the wrong choice first, and then he made the right one. And the right one cost him 60 years of silence and a life lived alone in a house he was afraid to leave. That does not make him a hero. It makes him human, and it makes him honest. I am not here today to ask this court to pretend my grandfather was a good man. I am here because at the end of his life he asked me to finish what he could not. And I am here because his fear was not nothing. His fear is the reason these papers still exist. Without his fear, there is no record. Without his fear, Aaron Ellsworth's name is still a man who walked away. She looked at Prescott. Yes, my grandfather signed the papers, she said, and then he kept them. Both things are true. And if this court can hold both of them, I think the truth can survive a complicated man. She looked at Judge Blackwood. That is what I came to say, Your Honor. She stepped down. The walk back to the bench felt longer than the walk up. She did not look at the gallery. She did not need to. She could hear in the silence behind her the slow, careful breath of a room that had stopped pretending it was not listening. Pearl Brennan called Della Whitlock. The older woman walked to the stand without her coat. She had taken it off and laid it across Beckett, who had fallen asleep again in her arms. She passed the child to Maren as she rose. She put her hand on the Bible. She was sworn. She did not speak for a long moment. My father, she said finally, was named Thomas Whitlock. He worked for Piedmont Mining. He went out one morning in the spring of 1945 to walk to the company office, and he did not come home. We were told he had taken work in Cincinnati. He had told no one. He had taken no clothes. He had left his wedding ring on the dresser. She paused. My mother lived another 43 years, she said quietly. She kept his side of the bed empty. She set a place for him at supper on his birthday. She believed until the day she died that he was alive somewhere, and that one day a letter would come or a knock at the door. She lifted her chin. Silas Holloway knew, she said. He knew where my father went. He could not tell me. They had his family. He carried that knowledge from 1945 until the day he died. He carried it alone, and he never let it out of him, because he knew that the day he spoke somebody he loved would pay for it. She looked across the room at Maren. He waited until he had someone left to give the truth to, and he gave it to her, and here we are. She stepped down. Pearl Brennan stood. She turned to the gallery. Your Honor, she said. Petitioner has one additional matter. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. 3 people walked in, 2 men and a woman, middle-aged, dressed plainly. The woman walked first. She wore a dark coat and a small gold pin in the shape of a leaf on the lapel. Maren recognized her as no one she had ever seen, and yet somehow immediately as someone Roland Vance had seen many times. Your Honor. Pearl Brennan said, these are 3 former employees of Ironwood Holdings. They have in the last 48 hours come forward independently with sworn statements regarding current corporate practices around the acquisition of historically sensitive properties, including the systematic destruction of documents predating the corporate restructuring. They are prepared to testify. Roland Vance's face did not move, but his hand on the table in front of him closed very slowly into a fist. Prescott did not stand. Judge Blackwood looked over the top of her reading glasses at the 3 figures in the aisle. She looked at Roland Vance. She looked at Prescott. She looked last at Maren. She did not speak for a long moment. I have heard sufficient evidence to make a preliminary finding, she said. She tapped her gavel once, almost gently. This court finds sufficient cause for a formal inquiry into the historical operations of Piedmont Mining and its successor entities, including Ironwood Holdings, and their connection to the disappearance of named individuals during the years 1944 and 1945. I am issuing a temporary injunction against any acquisition or surface activity by Ironwood Holdings within a 3-mile radius of the Holloway parcel, pending further investigation. I am referring this matter to the Office of the State Attorney General with the recommendation that a reparations fund be established pending verification of the evidence presented here for the descendants of the affected families. She paused. And I want it noted on the record that the petitioner, Maren Holloway, has brought this matter forward at significant personal risk to herself and her children. The pursuit of truth, however delayed, serves the interests of justice. This court thanks her. She tapped the gavel. We are adjourned. The courtroom did not erupt. There was no cheer. There was instead a long collective breath. The breath of a room of people exhaling something they had been holding without knowing it for a generation. Mrs. Ellsworth was crying without sound. The young Beckett relative behind her was crying too. Pearl Brennan was already shaking the hand of the woman with the gold leaf pin. Roland Vance was already gone. Maren had not seen him leave. Wren came to her mother's side and slipped her hand into Maren's. The girl said nothing. There was nothing to say. They walked out of the courtroom together with Della and Beckett behind them into the cold, bright noon of a Cedar Hollow winter. And the people on the steps did not cheer either. But they stood one by one as Maren and her children came down out of the building, and they took off their hats, and they held their hats against their chests. The settlement was negotiated through the spring. Ironwood Holdings faced with the prospect of a full federal inquiry, and the press calls Pearl Brennan had been quietly placing for weeks requested a private resolution. The terms, when they came, were larger than Pearl had told Maren to expect. A monetary settlement to Maren as the current landowner in acknowledgement of the historical misuse of the property, and the documented intimidation campaign against her family. A reparations and restoration fund, administered by an independent commission for the descendants of the named workers. A permanent conservation easement on Holloway Ridge that would prevent any future mining or development on the parcel forever. And at Maren's insistence, the funding of a small memorial and education center on the site of the cabin, with the cabin itself preserved as it had been found. The radio restored the maps still on the wall. The names of the disappeared men listed on a single bronze plaque in the small clearing outside. Roland Vance was by midsummer no longer in West Virginia. He had been quietly transferred to a division of Ironwood operating in another state. He had not been promoted. He had not been disciplined. He had simply been removed from the equation the way a chess piece is taken off the board without ceremony when its usefulness ends. The main house was rebuilt by autumn. Maren did not let them tear it down. She had the rotted boards replaced, and the roof made sound, and the windows hung again, and the porch rebuilt so that the steps did not sag. But she would not let the contractors square the corners that had settled crooked over a century. The house, when it was finished, was the same house, just standing. Beckett, now 4, ran across the front yard in boots. His sister had picked out for him. His asthma quieter than it had been in 2 years. The mountain air doing what city alleys had not been able to do. Wren had her own room with a desk and a window that faced the ridge, and she had begun with a laptop and a small camera to record interviews with the families who had lost men. Her channel, when she launched it that summer, was small. The first video was Mrs. Ellsworth in her kitchen, telling the story of Aaron Ellsworth. The second was Della Whitlock telling the story of her father. The third was a man Maren had never met from a county over, whose grandfather had been on the Site 9 list. Down the slope behind the main house, on a cleared parcel that had once held only briars, 4 small cabins had been built. They had front porches, they had wood stoves, they had locks on the doors that opened from the inside. They were the first cabins of what Maren had named after some thought Holloway Haven. The first family had moved in July, a young mother with 2 children. The mother had cried for an hour in the kitchen sitting at Maren's table, the way Maren had once cried in Della's. Maren had not tried to stop her. She had only made tea. The dedication of the memorial was held on a Saturday in late September, on a day when the leaves had just begun to turn at the top of the ridge, the maples going red, the oaks going slow. A small bronze plaque had been set into a flat granite stone in the clearing outside the cabin. 43 names. Aaron Ellsworth was the first. Thomas Whitlock was the 11th. Some of the names had no family left to claim them. Maren had insisted that those names be there anyway. A man's name, she had said, was the smallest thing a man could be owed. A bugler from the local VFW post, an old man with a careful mouth, stood at the edge of the clearing and lifted his horn. He played taps. The notes carried up through the pines, slow and clear, the way they had carried at 1,000 small services in 1,000 small towns across the country for 150 years. Maren stood in front of the stone with Wren on one side and Beckett on the other. Della stood just behind her. Mrs. Ellsworth, leaning on her cane, stood with her hand on the granite. The families behind her had brought flowers. They laid them one by one against the stone. When the last note of the bugle had faded into the trees, no one moved for a long time. The wind came up off the valley and moved through the high branches and went on. That evening, after the families had gone home, after the casseroles had been put away in Della's kitchen, after Beckett had been put to bed, and Wren had gone up to her room to edit the day's footage, Maren stood alone on the front porch of the rebuilt main house, with a mug of cocoa in her hands. The first snow of the new winter had begun, a light, dry snow that would not stick, the kind that fell only to remind a person that the season was turning. Up on the ridge, the small window of the cabin glowed. Della had taken to keeping the oil lamp burning in it at night, the way she had begun to keep it on the morning of the hearing, and Maren had not asked her to stop. It looked from the porch like a single steady star low against the slope. She took the letter out of the pocket over her heart. It was worn at the folds now. She had read it many times. She unfolded it. She did not need to read most of it. She turned to the last page. One day her grandfather had written, "Someone in our bloodline will need this more than I needed my fear." She read the line and she folded the letter and she put it back over her heart. She lifted her face to the ridge. "I needed it, Grandpa," she said quietly into the falling snow, "and I'm not afraid anymore." The wind moved through the pines on the ridge the way it had moved through them in 1945, and the way it had moved through them on 1,000 winters before. And the small lit window of the cabin held steady against the dark like a man at his post, finally relieved.